The metal tip of a screwdriver scraped against my front lock at exactly 5:58 in the morning. My daughter-in-law whispered for my son to hurry, convinced I was just a fragile old woman asleep upstairs. They thought they were breaking into an easy fortune. They did not know I was standing on the other side of the door, wide awake, with a recorder in my pocket and my attorney waiting in the shadows to welcome them home. My name is Eleanor Hart, and at 63 years old, I thought I knew every sound my house could make. Standing in the dark hallway of my home in Maple Ridge, Colorado, I felt older than the Rocky Mountains that loomed in the distance. The oak floorboards were freezing against my bare feet, biting into my skin with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I stared at the grandfather clock in the hallway, watching the pendulum swing. The second hand swept past the 12. It was exactly 5:58 in the morning. The house was silent, but I was not asleep. I was waiting. Then it came. The scratching sound. It was the noise of metal grinding against brass, a violation of the quiet morning. I moved closer to the door, silent as a ghost in my own home. Through the thick wood, I heard the frantic, hushed voice of my daughter-in-law, Sophie. She was panting, her voice tight with urgency. She whispered, "Hurry up. Michael. She is still sleeping like the dead. Just a few more seconds." I could hear the strain in her voice as she tried to force a screwdriver into the mechanism, convinced that I was just a fragile old woman tucked away in bed, oblivious to the world. Poor Sophie. She did not know that the lock she was trying to violate was brand new. I had the locksmith replace every single cylinder in the house yesterday afternoon, paying him in cash and swearing him to silence. This moment was unfolding exactly how Julian Clark, my attorney, had said it would. He had predicted their timing and their desperation down to the minute. I leaned in and pressed my eye to the peephole. The fisheye lens distorted the image, but I would know my son anywhere. Michael stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His eyes were red and rimmed with dark circles, frantic and wild. He was clutching a canvas bag, and protruding from the top was the hooked end of a heavy iron crowbar. He was wearing his old company jacket with the HelioCore Systems logo on the chest, clinging to the fabric of a career he had lost months ago. He looked like a stranger, a desperate man willing to break into his childhood home. Suddenly, Sophie pulled back from the lock. She took a deep breath and pitched her voice high and shrill, screaming for the benefit of anyone in the neighborhood who might be waking up. She yelled, "Mom? Mum? It is me. Did you fall? Are you hurt inside? It was a performance?" A cheap theatrical trick to frame their break-in as a rescue mission, just in case a neighbor looked out their window. I felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down the back of my neck. My hands were trembling slightly at my sides. But I need to be clear about something. I was not shaking because I was afraid. Fear had left me weeks ago, replaced by something much colder. This trembling was the physical manifestation of rage that had cooled down into something hard and permanent, like tempered steel. I was watching the people I loved prepare to invade my sanctuary, and I felt nothing but a grim determination. Through the peephole, I saw Michael reach into the bag. He was done with the screwdriver. He was gripping the crowbar, his knuckles white. Before he could swing it, a deep, calm voice spoke from the shadows of the kitchen behind me. "It is time, Mrs. Hart. Let me handle the rest." I took a breath and gripped the cold metal of the deadbolt. I turned the thumb turn of the new lock effortlessly. I yanked the handle down and threw the door open. The morning air rushed in, sharp and cold. Michael and Sophie froze. They looked at me, eyes wide, and then their gaze travelled to the figure standing directly behind my shoulder. Julian Clark stepped into the light, looking impeccable in his black suit, holding a thick leather case file against his chest like a shield. The colour drained from Sophie's face so fast she looked like a corpse. Michael's mouth fell open, his jaw going slack. His grip failed him. The screwdriver Sophie had been holding slipped from her sweating fingers. It hit the wooden porch steps with a sharp, ringing clatter that echoed in the morning silence like a gunshot. They stood there, paralysed, looking at the mother they thought was feeble and the lawyer they did not know existed. But this standoff on my front porch is just the end of the line. To understand how a mother ends up staring at her only son while he holds a crowbar to her door, you have to understand how we got here. You need to go back to the day I made the mistake of opening this door and letting them walk into my life for the second time. 3 months ago. My life was defined by the quiet dignity of widowhood. My husband, Harold, had been gone for 2 years, taken by a sudden stroke that left a silence in our home that I never quite managed to fill. I lived alone in our 2-story wooden house here in Maple Ridge, surrounded by the things we had built together. The garden was my sanctuary, filled with the scent of the lavender bushes Harold had planted for me, and guarded by a heavy stone angel statue we had bought together on a trip to Santa Barbara 20 years ago. I used to talk to that angel while I weeded the flower beds, pretending that Harold was listening somewhere in the wind. I often found myself thinking about Michael when he was a boy. I remembered him sitting on the porch steps, clutching a stack of comic books, his knees scraped and his smile missing a tooth. Harold used to ruffle his hair and tell me that we were raising a decent man. He would say it with such pride, convinced that our son would grow up to be the kind of person who stood tall and did the right thing. Now, standing on the other side of this nightmare, that memory feels less like a comfort and more like a cruel joke, a prophecy that went terribly wrong. My days had a rhythm that kept the loneliness at bay. I spent my mornings inspecting produce at the farmer's market, my afternoons watering the hydrangeas, and my evenings watching cooking shows on the television. It was a solitary life, but it was peaceful. I had it under control. Then came that Thursday afternoon when the phone rang and shattered everything. Michael sounded terrible. His voice was hoarse and broken, the sound of a man who had been crying or screaming. He told me that HelioCore Systems, the tech startup he had joined with such high hopes, had declared bankruptcy without warning. He said they had lost everything. Their jobs were gone. The bank in Phoenix was foreclosing on their house because they were months behind on the mortgage. I was still processing the shock when Sophie grabbed the phone. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her at first. She wailed about how unfair it all was. But then she said the one thing calculated to break me. She told me that Liam, who was 11, and Emma, who was just 9, would have to sleep in their car that night if they did not find a roof. She kept saying that she did not want to be a burden, but they had absolutely nowhere else to turn. My maternal instinct overrode every ounce of caution I should have felt. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone, and I said the words that I would come to regret for the rest of my life. I told them to come home. I told them to stay with me, just until they were stable again. They arrived late that afternoon. I watched from the window as Michael pulled a battered, dirty SUV into the driveway. The grandchildren ran to me, and I hugged them tight, feeling a rush of love and purpose I had not felt in years. But then, Sophie stepped out of the car. She was beaming, her smile wide and triumphant, looking nothing like a woman who had just lost her home. What struck me, even then, was what she was carrying. She had 4 suitcases, and slung over her shoulder were 2 designer handbags that I knew cost more than my monthly pension check. They did not look like the luggage of a bankrupt family. That first dinner should have been my warning. We sat around the table, and Sophie spent the entire meal talking about the injustice of the system. She ranted about how the banks and her former bosses had conspired to ruin their lives. She never once took responsibility. Amidst her complaints, she looked around my dining room and made a comment that stuck in my throat. She said that the guest room was a little tight for 4 people, and sighed as if she were the one doing me a favor by being there. I ignored it. I was just so happy that the house wasn't silent anymore. I poured them tea and listened to their stories, feeling needed for the first time since Harold died. I did not realize that by opening my front door to family, I had just signaled the start of a slow, brutal invasion of my own life. It took only 7 days for the architecture of my life to begin shifting. It started with the furniture. I came home from the grocery store one Tuesday to find the living room transformed. Harold's favorite leather armchair, the one molded perfectly to the shape of his back after 40 years of reading the evening paper, was gone. In its place sat a low, beige sofa that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a social media catalogue, bland, stiff, and utterly soulless. When I asked where the chair was, Sophie just smiled that tight, bright smile of hers. She told me she had moved it to the garage because the smell of old tobacco smoke trapped in the leather was making the children cough. It was a lie. Harold had quit smoking 15 years before he died. But Sophie made me feel like a criminal for poisoning my grandchildren. She called the new sofa Instagrammable. I just called it uncomfortable. The erasure continued to the mantelpiece. For decades, that shelf had held our wedding photos and a picture of Michael's high school graduation. By the weekend, they had vanished. In their place stood 3 wooden signs purchased from a discount home decor store. They read, "Live, laugh, love" in generic cursive script. When I asked Sophie why she had taken down my memories, she patted my arm as if I were a child and said that the house needed new energy. She said the old photos made the room feel heavy. I looked to Michael for support. For a moment, I saw a flicker of annoyance in his eyes as he looked at the empty spot where his father's picture used to be. But then Sophie pulled him aside. I heard her whispering urgently about how much more the house would be worth if they modernized the interior, mentioning that when the deed was eventually in his name, the resale value would double if they staged it right. Michael's annoyance evaporated, replaced by a greedy sort of compliance. He stopped looking at the empty mantel and started looking at the walls like he was calculating square footage. Then came the aggressive kindness. Sophie hired a professional cleaning service, insisting that I needed to rest and stop slaving away. It sounded sweet, but it was a purge disguised as a service. Slowly, my personal treasures began to disappear. Harold's collection of rare jazz records, which he had spent a lifetime curating, vanished from the shelves. My grandmother's antique wall clock, the one that chimed every hour, was gone. Sophie claimed things were just being organized, but I never saw them again. I mentioned this to my neighbor, Donna. She is 67, sharp-tongued, and has lived next door for 30 years. We stood by the backyard fence, and I tried to make excuses for them. I told her they were just trying to help me move on from my grief. Donna looked me dead in the eye and shook her head. She told me that my daughter-in-law was not helping me move on. She said Sophie was evaporating me from my own house, one object at a time. I defended them to Donna. But at night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I could hear the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the floorboards downstairs in the middle of the night. My sleep became fragmented. That was when Sophie started working on my mind. It began with small things. She would walk into the kitchen and gasp, rushing to the stove to turn off a burner that I was certain I had not touched. She would look at me with wide, worried eyes and ask if I remembered leaving the gas on. Other times, she would answer a question I had just asked by saying that we had already discussed it 5 minutes ago. She would ask why I was repeating myself. She was planting seeds of doubt, making me question my own sanity. Michael picked up on the narrative. He started using a tired, heavy voice, acting like the weight of caring for me was crushing him. He sat me down one evening and told me that maybe I should think about moving into a facility that offered care 24/7. He said it was for my own good because he was terrified that one day I would fall and no one would be there to catch me. By the end of the month, I walked into my own living room and stopped in front of the hallway mirror. The warm, yellow walls had been painted a cold, sterile grey. The scent of Harold's old books and my lavender was gone, replaced by the chemical smell of cheap vanilla candles Sophie had placed on every surface. I looked at my reflection, and for the first time, I did not feel like the owner of the house at 41 Maple Crest Lane. I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, living in a grey box that was slowly closing in on me. Sophie turned her attention to my finances with the precision of a surgeon. It started with the kitchen stove. She claimed my vintage gas range, a sturdy appliance that had roasted 30 turkeys for 30 Thanksgivings, was a leaking death trap. She convinced me it was blowing up our utility bill and endangering the children. She ordered a sleek, smart electric induction cooktop, promising she would pay it off in monthly installments. But when the confirmation email arrived, I saw she had charged the full amount to my credit card. When I asked her about it, she waved her hand and said it was better for my credit score this way. Then came the afternoon. I walked past the guest room and heard her on the phone. Her voice was low and excited. She was telling someone about a set of antique English china. She said she had a buyer lined up who would pay $6,000 or $7,000 if she found the right collector. My heart hammered against my ribs. That was the Royal Doulton set Harold had gifted me for our 30th anniversary. It was the tangible proof of 3 decades of love. I stormed into the room, trembling with a rage I had not felt in years. I told her to put the phone down and that she was forbidden from selling my memories. I expected an apology. Instead, I got an ambush. Michael appeared in the doorway behind me, and without missing a beat, he sided with his wife. He looked at me with disappointment and said I was too attached to material objects. He asked how I could hoard dusty plates when his children needed tuition money for a private school he could no longer afford. The argument escalated until Sophie played her ace. She burst into tears, dropping to her knees to hug Liam and Emma, who had wandered into the hallway. She shrieked that she did not want her babies to go to bed hungry just because their grandmother loved a stack of old porcelain more than she loved her own flesh and blood. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I looked at the confused faces of my grandchildren, and the guilt washed over me, thick and suffocating. I felt like a monster. I relented. I told her to sell the china, but I made her promise the money would go strictly toward the children's education. 3 days later, Sophie walked through the door carrying shopping bags. She was wearing a brand new pair of Italian leather heels and a designer handbag. When she saw me staring, she laughed and said she had caught an incredible sale and that a woman needed to look professional to get a new job. My neighbour Donna caught me staring at Sophie's new shoes in the backyard later that week. She leaned over the fence and lowered her voice. She told me that truly hungry people do not buy $400 shoes. Her words planted a crack in my denial, but I was not ready to see the whole ugly truth yet. Sophie must have sensed my growing suspicion because she immediately shifted tactics. She stopped buying things and started dying. It began with complaints of dizziness and severe pain in her lower abdomen. She spent her days lying on the sofa with a cold compress on her forehead. At night, she would moan softly, just loud enough for the sound to drift through the thin walls and keep me awake with worry. The performance culminated on a Tuesday evening. Sophie was in the kitchen pouring water when she suddenly gasped and collapsed onto the floor. The glass shattered. Michael screamed. He fumbled for his phone to call emergency services, but Sophie grabbed his wrist. She whispered weakly that he could not call because they did not have the money for an ambulance ride or a hospital stay. It was a masterclass in manipulation. I was trapped. I could not let my daughter-in-law die on my kitchen floor because of poverty. I demanded they take her to a specialist and said I would cover it. The next morning, Sophie handed me a piece of paper. It was a cost estimate from a private, luxury medical center for the treatment of a complex ovarian tumor. The bottom line was staggering. It was $95,000. Sophie wept silently, saying she would rather die than take my money. Michael looked at the floor, his shoulders shaking. I went to the bank that afternoon. I sat in the leather chair across from the loan officer, fighting back a wave of nausea. I liquidated the bulk of the retirement savings Harold and I had spent 40 years building. As I signed the cashier's check, my hand felt heavy, as if my body was trying to stop me. I handed over my future to save her life, not knowing I was funding the very weapon they would use to destroy me. For weeks, Sophie played the role of the valiant cancer patient, but the details began to blur. She claimed to be undergoing aggressive chemical treatments, yet she attacked her dinner with the appetite of a linebacker. Her skin was not pale or grey. It was flushed and healthy. She only seemed to remember her terminal illness when I walked into the room. The moment she saw me, her shoulders would slump, and she would let out a long, weary sigh, clutching her stomach. I tried to scold myself for being a paranoid old woman, but the discrepancy between her medical chart and her glowing complexion was gnawing at me. The truth did not come from a doctor, but from a coffee shop booth. Donna dragged me into the cafe near the farmer's market one morning, her expression grim. She gripped my hand across the table and told me that her cousin worked as a receptionist at an exclusive aesthetic surgery center in Denver. Donna lowered her voice and told me that a patient named Sophie Hart had not been receiving chemotherapy on the 15th of the month. She had been on an operating table undergoing a rhinoplasty. My world tilted on its axis. I drove home in a daze and found Sophie in the living room. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks. The swelling had subsided, and the change was undeniable. The bridge of her nose was narrower, the tip slightly elevated and refined. When I asked her why her face looked different, she laughed and touched her cheek. She told me that the sickness was making the weight fall off her face. It was a lie so bold and so casual that it took my breath away. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. while the sound of giggling drifted through the thin drywall from the guest room. It was not the sound of a family facing a medical crisis. It was the sound of people celebrating a heist. In the silence, I finally let the pieces click together. The antique china sold for tuition, the $95,000 drained from my retirement, the mysterious treatments, the new designer bags, the sudden smell of expensive perfume. It was not a tragedy. It was a robbery. At 2 a.m, I got out of bed. My throat was dry, and I needed water to wash down the bile rising in my chest. I walked down the stairs in the dark, my bare feet silent on the wood. As I approached the kitchen, I felt a draft. The sliding glass door was cracked open, and the smell of cigarette smoke drifted in. They were on the back porch. I pressed myself against the velvet curtains, invisible in the shadows. I heard Sophie's voice, clear and confident in the night air. She was mapping out the endgame. She told Michael that in a few months, they would convince me to transfer the deed of the house to his name to save on future inheritance taxes. She said that once the paper was signed, they would move me into a state-subsidized senior care facility in Nebraska she had found online. Then she said the words that killed the last remnant of my love for her. She said that I had lived long enough, and now it was their turn to enjoy life. I waited for Michael to defend me. I waited for my son to say no. Instead, I heard the flick of a lighter. Michael took a drag and said that the house was worth at least $1,800,000. He said it was enough for them to move to California and start over. I felt like I was floating above my own body, watching a stranger's heart break. My own son was agreeing to package me up and mail me away to a warehouse for the elderly so he could buy a condo by the beach. But as the shock faded, the tears did not come. Instead, a cold, heavy clarity settled in my chest. The mother in me died on that porch, and something else took her place. I crept back upstairs without making a sound. I went to the closet and pulled down the old cedar box where Harold kept our most important documents. I pushed aside the original deed to the house and reached for a small, cream-colored business card that had been gathering dust for 5 years. It belonged to Julian Clark, Harold's oldest friend and the sharpest shark of an attorney in the county. I held the card in the moonlight, staring at the embossed letters. I was done being the victim. It was time to rewrite the will. I sat across from Julian Clark in his downtown office, surrounded by walls of mahogany and the scent of old paper. I told him everything. I did not cry. I laid out the timeline of my stupidity with clinical precision, detailing the move-in, the furniture, the isolation tactics, and finally, the $95,000 I had drained for a cancer treatment that never happened. Julian did not offer me pity. He offered me strategy. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses, and began an interrogation that felt less like a conversation and more like a surgical procedure. He asked for specific dates. He asked for bank transfer receipts. He asked if I had ever signed a power of attorney document under duress. Then he leaned back and said the words that made the reality of my situation legal and concrete. He told me that this was textbook financial elder abuse. He explained that what Michael and Sophie were doing was not just immoral. It was a crime. He proposed a solution that was as brilliant as it was final. He suggested we create an irrevocable trust. He explained that we would transfer the title of the house into this trust immediately. The terms would be ironclad. The only beneficiaries would be my grandchildren, Liam and Emma, and even they could not touch the property until they turned 25. I would retain the right to live in the property for the rest of my life. The most important clause was the one that stripped Michael and Sophie of any claim. If they attempted to coerce me or challenge the trust, they would lose even their parental management rights over the asset. Julian looked at me and asked a question that cut through the air. He asked if I wanted to be a victim or a plaintiff. I looked at the man who had known my husband for decades. I took a slow breath and told him that I did not want to be either. I wanted to be the survivor. Julian nodded and gave me my marching orders. He told me to go home and gather evidence. He needed text messages, emails, and recordings that proved their intent to defraud me. I went to Donna. She drove me to an electronics store 2 towns over so we would not be seen. We bought a digital voice recorder the size of a pack of gum. Donna showed me how to use it, taping over the blinking red light with black electrical tape so it would remain invisible in the dark. I became a spy in my own home. I resumed my role as the confused, fading old woman. I would shuffle into the living room, complain about my knees, and fumble with my glasses while slipping the recorder into the soil of the large ficus plant in the corner. I hid another one under the wicker bench on the back porch. The things I captured were enough to curdle my blood. One evening, the recorder in the plant picked up Sophie's voice while I was at the grocery store. She was talking about Harold's stamp collection. She called it a pile of useless paper and said she had found a dealer who would take it for $2,000 cash. No questions asked. But the recording from the back porch was the nail in the coffin. I captured Sophie telling Michael that the moment I signed the house over, she was going to change every lock. She said she would not have that senile old woman inviting her trashy friends over anymore. I took the device back to Julian's office 3 days later. We sat in silence and listened to the playback. We heard Michael's voice, clear as day, admitting to Sophie that he had already spent a chunk of the money I gave them. He admitted he used the cancer funds to pay off his credit cards and put a deposit down on a pre-construction condo in San Diego. Julian stopped the tape. He looked at me and said we had enough evidence to bury them in court. But he said we needed to be smarter than that. We needed to close the trap. He told me to go home and finish the performance. He wanted me to suggest the transfer myself. He told me to make them believe they had won so that they would lower their guard and show their true faces on the day we chose to strike. That evening, I set the stage for the final act over a plate of dry meatloaf. I put down my fork, let out a long, trembling sigh, and looked at my son and daughter-in-law with watery eyes. I told them that I was exhausted. I said that I had been having trouble sleeping and that I was terrified of falling down the stairs in the middle of the night. I looked at Michael and said that perhaps they were right all along. I told them it was time to think about transferring the house to make things simpler. The reaction was immediate. Sophie did not even try to hide her excitement. Her eyes lit up, and she leaned over the table, nearly knocking over her water glass. She asked if I meant transferring the deed to them so I could move into a better community. The greed in her voice was so naked it was almost nauseating. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from screaming the truth at her. Instead, I forced a weak smile and said that I just wanted to make everything simple for my family. I suggested that we use Julian Clark to handle the paperwork since he knew the property history. Sophie was ecstatic. She immediately started talking about taking a day off from her temporary job at the supermarket to be present for the signing. Before dinner was even finished, she was already planning aloud how she would set up her new home office in Harold's old study. She talked about tearing out the built-in bookshelves to make room for a modern desk. It took every ounce of my willpower to sit there and nod while she planned the desecration of my husband's sanctuary. A small disaster nearly derailed everything the next afternoon. I had left the draft of the irrevocable trust on my desk for just a moment when Liam walked into the room. He picked up the heavy document and asked me in his innocent voice if I was writing a will for them. My heart hammered against my ribs. I gently took the papers from his hands and lied to his face. I told him they were just boring insurance papers and made him promise not to tell his parents because I wanted the insurance to be a surprise. He nodded and ran off, unaware that he had almost blown the cover off the entire operation. The night before the scheduled signing, I put the final piece of the trap in place. I had arranged for a locksmith to come late in the evening, under the pretense that the back door latch was sticking. In reality, I had him replace every cylinder in the house front, back, and garage. I paid him the last of my cash savings, my hands shaking as I handed over the bills. I was terrified that Michael would hear the sound of the drill or notice the new shine on the deadbolts. But he was too busy in the living room celebrating his premature victory with a bottle of beer. Later that night, I sat alone in my bedroom with the lawsuit Julian had prepared. For a moment, my resolve faltered. I looked at the legal language that would declare war on my own blood. I asked myself if I was destroying any chance of reconciliation. I wondered if I was a bad mother. But then the memory of Sophie's voice on the recording played in my mind. I heard her say that I had lived long enough. I heard Michael agree. I gripped my pen until my knuckles turned white and signed every page of the trust. The morning sun had not yet risen when Emma crept into my room. She handed me a piece of paper. It was a crayon drawing of 4 stick figures holding hands in front of our house. She whispered that she did not want to leave. It felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I hugged her and realized that I was not doing this to hurt her parents. I was doing this to save her future. I was protecting the only inheritance she would ever have from being gambled away by her father and mother. My phone buzzed with a text message from Julian. He confirmed that the trust had been officially recorded at the county clerk's office. He told me he would arrive 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting time and would enter through the back door, as we had discussed. His final message read simply that, from this moment on, I was no longer the prey. I walked downstairs to the living room. The walls were still that cold, alien grey that Sophie had chosen, but the air felt different. I placed my hand against the plaster. It felt solid. I closed my eyes and whispered a promise to Harold. I told him that tomorrow I would take back our home. I told him I would take it back exactly the way he would have wanted. Julian stood in the kitchen with the stillness of a statue. He placed his leather briefcase on the kitchen table and looked at me with a gaze that demanded absolute focus. He told me that in a moment. I was going to open that door. He instructed me to do exactly 2 things. I was to unlock the deadbolt, and I was to offer absolutely no apologies. On the other side of the wood, the situation was deteriorating. Sophie was losing her composure. The lock was not yielding to her screwdriver, and her frustration was mounting. She began to shout, pitching her voice loud enough to reach the street. She yelled, "Mum, answer me. I am afraid you are having a stroke." It was a brilliant, sick piece of improvisation. She was creating a cover story for the neighbours while simultaneously trying to mask the sound of metal grinding against metal. Behind her, I knew Michael was shifting his weight, sliding the heavy iron crowbar out of the canvas bag, preparing to shatter the doorframe if the lock did not give. I placed my hand on the cold brass of the doorknob. For a split second, my mind betrayed me. I flashed back to 30 years ago, remembering the sound of this door flying open as a 6-year-old Michael ran in from the school bus, dropping his backpack to hug my legs. I had to physically shake that memory away. The man standing outside was not that boy. The man outside was a stranger who had agreed to erase me. I turned the thumb turn. I pulled the handle. The door swung open. Sophie nearly stumbled into the foyer, her weight thrown forward by the force she had been applying to the tool. She looked up, ready to shout at me, but the words died in her throat. She was not looking at a confused old woman. She was looking at Julian Clark, who had stepped out from the kitchen shadows to stand directly behind my right shoulder like a guardian. Julian adjusted his cuffs and spoke with a voice that carried no emotion, only authority. He introduced himself as Julian Clark, the legal counsel for Mrs. Hart and the sole representative of this estate. Michael was standing on the porch step, caught in the act. He tried to shuffle the crowbar behind his back, attempting to hide it in the folds of his jacket. Julian did not let him get away with it. He pointed a finger directly at my son and asked if he was holding a tool for forced entry, while the homeowner was standing right there denying him access. Michael turned the colour of ash. His grip failed, and he dropped the crowbar. The heavy iron hit the brick pavers with a violent, ringing clatter that silenced the birds in the yard. Sophie recovered first. Her face flushed red, and she immediately went on the offensive. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was senile. She accused Julian of being a predator who was manipulating a confused elderly woman for his own financial gain. She started crying, wailing that they were just a concerned family trying to get some paperwork signed for my own safety. Julian did not argue. He simply opened his briefcase. He pulled out a crisp, stapled document and held it up for them to see. He began to read the key terms aloud, his voice cutting through Sophie's theatrics. He explained that, as of yesterday, the title to the property at Maplecrest Lane had been transferred into an irrevocable trust. He stated that Eleanor Hart retained the right to inhabit the property for the rest of her natural life. He clarified that the sole beneficiaries of the trust were Liam and Emma, and they would only inherit the title upon reaching the age of 25. He emphasized the final clause, which stated that any attempt to coerce the resident or leverage her age against her would be considered a criminal act and grounds for the parents to lose their custodial management of the asset. Sophie looked like she had been slapped. She screamed that this was a betrayal of her rights as a mother and a daughter-in-law. I did not say a word. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder. I placed it on the entryway table and pressed the play button. The sound of crickets chirping filled the silence, followed by Sophie's voice, clear and cruel in the night air. Everyone heard her say that I had lived long enough and that the house belonged to them. Then came Michael's dry, agreeing laugh. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I looked up to see Liam and Emma standing at the top of the stairs, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. They had heard everything. Michael looked at the floor. He stammered, his voice weak and pathetic. He tried to say that he did not mean it, that he had only said those things in the heat of the moment because he was stressed. Julian closed his briefcase with a snap. He looked at my son and delivered the final blow. He said that the court does not care about the temperature of his emotions. He said the court only cares about the evidence. Julian presented them with two distinct paths, and he did not offer a third. Path 1 was an immediate surrender. They would vacate my premises within 48 hours and sign a legally binding confession and repayment plan for every cent they had misappropriated. Path 2 was total war. I would file a civil suit backed by the audio recordings and bank records, which Julian assured them would trigger a criminal investigation for fraud and elder abuse. He let the silence hang in the air before adding that a felony conviction would likely strip them of their legal custody rights over Liam and Emma. Sophie reacted with the instinct of a cornered rat. She turned on Michael instantly. She screamed that she had only been following her husband's lead. She claimed that she was just a loyal wife trying to secure a better future for her family. She tried to twist her greed into some twisted form of maternal sacrifice, shouting that she had only done it because the system was unfair to them. It was repulsive to watch her throw him to the wolves to save her own skin. And then, Michael broke. The man who had stood on my porch with a crowbar just moments ago collapsed onto the area rug. He began to sob, a deep, ugly sound of total defeat. He confessed everything between jagged breaths. He admitted that the $95,000 I had given them for Sophie's fake cancer treatment had not just gone to the condo deposit. A massive portion of it had gone to pay off online gambling debts he had been hiding for years. He was not just a thief. He was an addict who had cannibalized his mother's retirement to feed his vice. He crawled toward me on his knees and grabbed my hands. His palms were clammy. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and begged for forgiveness. He kept repeating that he still loved me. I looked down at him, searching for the little boy I had raised, the one Harold had been so proud of. But I saw nothing. The emotional connection had been severed. I felt only a vast, hollow emptiness where my motherly affection used to be. I pulled my hands away from his grip. I spoke to him with a voice that was calm and terrifyingly cold. I told him that if his version of love included planning to dump me in a cheap nursing home so he could buy a condo by the beach, then I did not have any use for that kind of love. Liam walked down the last few steps, his voice shaking. He asked if they really had to leave the house. The pain of that question nearly broke my resolve, but I pulled him and Emma into a hug. I looked them in the eyes and told them that this house would be theirs one day. I promised them that. But I explained that right now. Their parents had to leave because I could not live with people who had tried to destroy me. Sophie tried to use them as a shield. She grabbed their shoulders and hissed that I was being cruel to my own grandchildren. Julian stepped in, cutting her off. He reminded her that it was her scheme that had severed the family ties, not my reaction to it. I delivered my final decision. I gave Michael 30 days to arrange for the repayment of the $95,000 plus the value of the antique china. If the money did not appear, I would press charges. Then I told them they had exactly 48 hours to remove themselves and their belongings from my property. The atmosphere in the house turned heavy and toxic. Sophie went into a frenzy of packing, and I heard the crash of ceramic as she smashed one of the cheap vases she had bought, a final act of petty destruction. Michael hid in the garage, unable to look at me. The children quietly packed their toys in the hallway. I stood at the living room window, looking out at their SUV in the driveway. I had won, but there was no joy in it. I did not feel light. I just felt the crushing weight of the truth. 2 days later, at 10 minutes before 6 in the evening, Michael knocked on my door for the last time. He looked 10 years older than he had 48 hours ago. He did not try to step inside. Instead, he handed me a thick manila envelope with trembling hands. He told me it contained $32,000. He explained that he had sold his sports car for cash that morning and liquidated what little was left of his retirement fund. He asked for more time to get the rest. I took the envelope and placed it on the entryway table. I looked him in the eye and told him clearly that this money was not a bargaining chip for my affection. I told him it was simply the first step in facing his legal responsibilities. I agreed to the 30-day extension I had promised. But I made one thing crystal clear. I told him that while I was extending the deadline for the debt, I was not extending the lease on my motherly love. That contract had been broken the night he agreed to sell my home out from under me. In the final private moment before he turned to leave, Michael looked at me with wet eyes. He asked if I still considered him my son. I felt my heart being pulled in two directions. One half of me wanted to grab the little boy I remembered, but the other half heard the click of the tape recorder and his laughter in the dark. I finally answered him. I said that today. He was not my son. I told him that the future depended entirely on how he chose to live, not on how well he knew how to beg. Liam and Emma ran up to me before they got into the car. They hugged me tight, burying their faces in my apron. Emma was sobbing. She asked if I promised that they could come back to this house someday. I held her face in my hands and promised her that she could return. But I added a condition. I told her she could come back when she was old enough to make that decision for herself, not when her parents were using her as a tool to manipulate me. The engine of the old SUV roared to life. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, refusing to even turn her head in my direction. Michael looked at me through the rearview mirror as he put the car in gear. I did not raise my hand to wave. I just stood there, still as a statue, listening to the sound of the tires crunching away over the cobblestone driveway that Harold had paved with his own hands 30 years ago. A moment later, Julian walked out from the kitchen where he had been waiting. He set his briefcase down and handed me a document stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. He confirmed that the trust was fully active and secure. He watched the dust settle in the driveway and asked me a quiet question. He asked if they failed to pay the rest of the money, would I really go through with the lawsuit and send my own son to court? I thought about it for a long time. Then I looked at Julian and told him yes. I said I would do exactly what I had threatened. It was not because I wanted blind revenge. It was because I refused to let them believe that they could defraud an elderly woman and wash away the crime just by crying about it. I told him that the price they had to pay was the only lesson that would save them. And more importantly, it was the only thing that would save those two children from becoming just like their parents. That night, for the first time in months, I ate dinner alone in my kitchen. The silence was not lonely. It felt like freedom. I opened a bottle of vintage red wine that Harold had been saving for a special occasion. I figured surviving my own family was special enough. I turned on a digital playlist of the jazz albums Sophie had thrown away. The music filled the room, and I made a vow to myself. I would slowly buy back the pieces of the life I had lost. I do not have a fairy tale ending for you. I lost the son I thought would be my Cain in my old age. That wound will never fully heal. But I gained something far more valuable. I regained the right to determine the course of my own life. I regained my sanctuary. And most importantly, I regained my self-respect. I walked to the front door as the twilight settled over Maple Ridge. I reached out and touched the cold metal of the new lock. I remembered the sound of the screwdriver grinding against the brass that morning, the sound of entitlement trying to break in. I smiled, a very faint, small smile. Then I stepped back and closed the door firmly, locking it against the night. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge is not destroying your enemy. It is simply having the courage to lock the door on the people you used to love so you can protect the life you have left. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Everyone, I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on what you would have done in my shoes. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this video get heard by more people who might need to hear it.